I recently launched a free roleplay service where candidates are supposed to find each other and roleplay before, whether be it a phone interview, but more interestingly for an on-site interview where these behavioral questions are more important. And one of the questions that I was getting asked the most was, what types of questions can we roleplay with, or can you give us any supporting material for this? So I decided to make a video on a full on-site interview with 5 rounds covering 2 principles each. So this is what I'm going to present you next in this video, and of course towards the end of the video I'm going to also give you a diagram, as you can see just behind me, with all the questions grouped. So by the way, I also have a cheat sheet which I'm going to use throughout this video. So the most common introductory question in a job interview is to tell me about yourself, where actually the expectation is that you would introduce yourself and talk about some of the highlights in your career, your strengths, and essentially about your projects. And ideally, the best interviewers that I know would start from that conversation and move on into the behavior that they're interested to screen you on. So for example, if you'd be talking about, I don't know, 2 best achievements in your career, my follow-up could be, okay, but can you think of a time when towards the end of this project you had a major challenge, and how did you overcome that challenge? And one mistake here that many people do is to actually talk about, yeah, we actually had a major challenge here and I've done a mistake, and because of that we delayed the project by 3 months, which could actually turn out to be a deadly mistake, simply because the question itself, a time when you had a struggle towards the end of the project, and how you overcome it, is on deliver results. So you must ideally spot what they're actually looking for from that question. Now, it should be said, for more senior roles, you could sell yourself actually by presenting your failure, even if they don't ask you for one, so long as you emphasize on the learnings. But that's only for the senior roles, and from experience, around 85%, maybe 90% of the time, you'd be safer going with by answering the question you're getting asked and understanding the behavior, what they're actually looking for. Another question that might get asked in this first round of interview for the second leadership principle is a time when you had to deal with a difficult problem that required a lot of in-depth analysis. And here, another mistake that especially technical candidates make would be to take an example of a managerial role where they had to decide some on a resource allocation issue, something where this question is on dive deep. So ideally you should find a complex problem, a complex technical problem, because you're applying for a technical role, and you would explain about that specific problem. Some follow-up questions here could be, is there anything you wish you had done differently here? For example, because we all know we cannot be perfect all the time. Or how long did it take you to resolve this problem? Or did you take any outside help? These all could be follow-up questions for these second leadership principles in the first round of the interview. Now, for the second round of interview, let's begin with why do you want to work here? Why you? Or why Amazon? These are all, very much the same questions. And the reason why I'm also beginning the second round with a general type of question is to highlight the importance of these non-behavioral questions in a behavioral interview as a starting point for a conversation, or as a starting point for them to screen you on the principles that they are interested in. Now, next question. A time when you had to help an underperforming colleague. Which principle is this? So this is actually quite one of the easier questions to answer about earned trust, which is a very important leadership principle at Amazon. And basically, in any company that you apply for, earned trust is something goes hand in hand with teamwork. Many often, and it's something you want to take quite seriously. Now let's take another one. A time when you had to communicate change in your team, and what was your approach here? How did you ensure that you communicated change successfully in a team? Now, the number one mistake that people actually do here is to talk about a concept, a very interesting concept that they had to sell to their team, and how they arrived to that concept being the right type of concept, the mathematics, the technicalities of that concept. What they actually forget is that in real life, it never works this way. You can be as good at maths as possible, at mathematics or technically speaking, as good as you want, and chances are you won't be successful. You won't succeed just by with your skill set to convince your team. So which leadership principle do you think is this one? So it's again earn trust, and this is simply because, going back to the question of time when you sold something to your team, it's not only the technical things that must make sense, which is expected to make sense after all, but also how you sell yourself, how you gain their trust. So whenever you have to answer this one, ensure there's also the technical part, there's also the interpersonal, the earned trust side of things. This is one of the not so obvious questions to spot on this leadership principle. Next, a time when you had to sacrifice short-term goals for long-term value. So this is one of the classics, for the ownership principle at Amazon, and I do not see people struggling all that much with this one, so long as as you prepare in advance for the on-site interview, but still an interesting one to role-play. The next one, a time when you took something outside of your area of responsibility, but definitely your company's best interest. So again, it's one on ownership, and it's a pretty straightforward one to role play with. Now, just one closing note here. Notice here I mentioned 2 questions for each of the principles here, simply because this is a possibility, because they really need to screen you well on these principles. So if you give a perfect answer from the first try, they might not become as interested in screening you, in asking you 2 questions, but if not, they prefer to ask you multiple questions on the same principle, so you should know. Tell me about yourself. So as you can see, it's multiple times that these questions might come across in an interview, and it always makes sense to prepare. I would even go as far as to advise you to prepare 2 versions for tell me about yourself, the longer and the more concise ones, and to really spot the interviewer and tune up your answer as to make sense for your conversation. A time when you had to disagree, when you disagreed with your boss but still had to deliver on what they asked. So this one would be on have backbone, disagree, and commit. This one I intentionally framed this way because I wanted to ensure that you will give the right answer. But if I would have framed it a time when you had disagreed with your boss, the reflex would have been to tell, hey, you were wrong, my boss. In many cases, people are not very agreeable on these things, which is perfectly fine so long as you make sense. But you should know that on have backbone, disagree, and commit, there's only a fine line between being arrogant and being actually having backbone. So it's oftentimes that people find it easier to talk about an example where they were wrong actually, and they committed to that, and that they eventually found that their boss had some other information about these things. But still a very important question, a time when you disagreed with your boss but still had to deliver on the assignment. A time when you had to take a risk in a fast-paced project. Now this one is on bias for action, as you might expect. One thing you want to keep in mind, something you want to keep in mind here is you really want to ensure it was a proper risk. Right? So it must really there must be some danger there if you want. This is the only feedback that I would say is a questionable one on this bias for action. But usually people do well with bias for action. Now for round 4, tell me about the time when you relentlessly worked on improving the quality of a fully working product, service, or process. Which leadership principle do you think is this one? So this is insist on the highest standards. It should be straightforward for the right type of candidates, but some people also tend to get into ownership in this case, which is fine, but so you should know that insist on the highest standards is the main attraction here. And the other one would be a time when you had to take a complicated decision that required input from various sources, from various stakeholders. How did you go about arriving to that best possible decision? Now, which principle do you think is this one? So this is on I write a lot. And I write a lot, it's here's another one for I write a lot that is super relevant also to roleplay. A time when you had to deal with an ambiguous situation, such as when you didn't have enough data to take the right decision. How did you go about removing that ambiguity? And if you want, this question go hand in hand together, but usually because of this principle, I write a lot is not very straightforward to understand that. You likely get asked more than one question about them, or at least they've been interested in diving deeper into these types of questions. So if you want a couple of follow-up questions for this last one, for time when you had to deal with ambiguity, what was the risk? What would have happened if you had done nothing there? Why was this your decision, the best decision? And is there anything you wish you'd done better here? Or couldn't you have maybe moved faster with this decision? Or what if you delegated more responsibility in here? What if you delegated less responsibility here? But essentially, this ideally it should be a starting point again of a conversation with follow-up questions. And finally, round 5. Think of a time when you came up with a simple solution to a complex problem. Now, this is on invent and simplify, and unless you prepare in advance or unless you really get into the heat of behavioral interviewing, you'll probably struggle a little bit to find the best possible example for this one. But still, it's an interesting exercise, and you'll be fine so long as you prepare for it. And the other question would be a time when you were unclear about the customer's request, and how did you go about clarifying that request? Now, by elimination, you'll know that this would be on customer obsession, as we haven't covered it previously. And needless to say that you should show your customer obsession when compared your customer focus, right? So it's literally about going above and beyond for the customer, not just doing just fixing the customer's problem. So think of examples where you delivered excellence. This is the key with the customers. And I know many of you are working with internal customers, but still it makes sense to talk about excellence in this context. Now, to recap, I made a diagram, which I'll show right now on screen, which you can screenshot and print out to use for your role play. It's also categorized by principle and by interview round, as you can see. And there you go. These would be the more interesting scenarios that I think you could be role-playing with someone. And I also dropped, of course, a link in the video description to the service, to help you match with other candidates. And thank you for watching.